Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Andre Dijon, and I'm the director of the Canadian Center for the Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory. This is the land, the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and it has been for millennia. It's also the traditional homeland of the Métis. We're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its value, reflect on its beauty, and reaffirm our commitment to shared, necessary, and important reconciliation of both universities and college. Now, today's talk marks an important milestone for our center. It's our 40th anniversary. And I say our center and our 40th because the center belongs to all of us. It belongs to anyone who's ever worked at, for, or with the center. It belongs to anyone who's read the center paper, anyone who's been at the center talk, anyone who's attended a center reception or a gathering, formal or informal. Anyone who has awareness of the center is, you're all part of the center in some way, shape, or form. And I say this because while organizations like ours may exist in law or in policies and form, they only really come alive in our imaginations. They only prosper when we feel them. They are at the end of the day acts of will, intention, and purpose. They exist because we invoke them into being. So to help us kickstart the spirit of celebrating this our center, I cannot think of a better person to remind us of the importance of attention, the importance of productive, enduring imagination. And our speaker today, Dr. Brett. So welcome, Brett. I'm going to do some introductory remarks about you, and then we'll get it going. Sounds great. So almost since the beginning, since 1986, Brett has been core to our center. And if I'm not mistaken, Brett was initially hired with support from the center. Is that correct? And he did not just publish extensively with our center. In fact, some of our most downloaded publications are Brett Fairbairn authored papers. And I'm told that he has written, in aggregate, more than 80 publications on cooperative history, governance, leadership. And his most recent publication, which we normally have already, is called Risk and Relevance, the Transformation of Campus Cooperative Retailing System. And it's become a bit of a Bible for the center and its interaction with CRS and its wholesaler federated cooperatives. I'd like to think, though, and Brett, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but you were never a pure Eiffel Tower academic. I've heard stories from you and others about extensive outreach with the cooperative sector out there where decisions get made, that kind of information process. Whether it was consulting on governance, leadership, or history, my sense is Brett has always put his research into action. And that, too, is core to our center and its identity. It's why we're here. Brett has also carried the share of center's administrative role, serving as the director from 2000 to 2004, and again in 2015. Brett's university experience, of course, transcends his relationship with our center. He's seen universities from top to bottom as a new academic in the mid-1980s, serving as the University of Saskatchewan's provost and vice president academic from 2008 until 2014. Since 2018, he served as president and vice-chancellor of Thompson University in beautiful Kamloops, British Columbia. So we've invited Brett here today because he's uniquely positioned to speak to something core to our center, namely his relationships with the university environment. He's positioned to speak on this topic not just because of his experience, but because he's actually put some thoughts down on paper in a 2016 publication called Co-ops and Universities, Some Reflections. So at the time, Brett argued that cooperatives and universities can enjoy a productive relationship, thanks to the overlap in their respective missions, service to the public, but also cautioning about the importance of each party recognizing and respecting the other's identity, constraints, and functions. But does that argument still hold? That's what Brett's going to talk to us about today. Now, because this is a hybrid event, we're going to be tweaking our format a little bit for those of you who are familiar with the co-op conversations. Brett's going to present for about 15 minutes. Afterwards, we're going to have an open question and answer period with people online and in person. So if you're in person, we're going to ask you to just raise your hand and we'll walk a microphone over to you and get you ready to ask your question. If you're online, we're going to ask you to type your question into the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll raise your question as we move through that conversation. So if anyone's experiencing online technical difficulties, you can mention Stan U, who stands running around furiously trying to sort out things here at this reason. We will be recording the session, and the link will be shared with everyone who registered for this. And all this will be emailed to you afterwards. So with that, that's the baton over to Red, and looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Marc-Andre, and it's a pleasure to be back here in Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of Métis. It's part of the world I have roots in. My mother was born on Upmanstead, 3 miles outside of Star City, Saskatchewan. And I have grandparents and parents who were members of and employees of cooperatives and credit unions. And I've always thought that there was a connection between the spirit of the treaties and the spirit of this university and of this center, namely people working in parallel for the advancement of all. I've spent the last 6 years in the beautiful nation of Secwepemcúlecw in the heart of the southern interior of British Columbia. Norm and I live on the unceded ancestral territory of Tecumseh, Secwepemc in Kamloops, BC. And of course, part of my roots here are roots here at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives, having spent decades as a faculty member at the centre. So it's great to be back, great to see the centre doing well and celebrating that 40th anniversary since it became active. And great as well to be back here and able to meet with colleagues in person. That's something I especially appreciate. Maybe historians are old-fashioned. Online is good when it's convenient and when it's what's practical for people. But I really appreciate physically seeing the center, seeing the Johnson Triana School, and being here on campus and seeing those of you in the room. For those of you online, hello to all of you as well. I look forward to your questions. So as you can see, I have prepared an extensive presentation for you. Which may take 15 minutes perhaps, but as I'll explain, I particularly look forward to questions and to discussion. This is an opportunity to look back at something that I wrote in 2016, as Marc-Andre has said, Cooperatives in Universities, which was really, I guess from my point of view, it was something of a thought experiment in the form of an analytical essay. So the basic topic, I suppose, was how cooperatives and universities can work together effectively. And I'd say the main idea was really that it's important for the partners to understand not only their own interests, but the interests of their partners as well. It's a publication that was made available on the center's website, is still available on the center's website. You can download it for free. Go to the homepage of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives, which I'm sure you have bookmarked if it isn't already set as your homepage. Click on research, click on publications, scroll down to 2018. You can download it there. And if that's what you're interested in, we're done for today. But I do want to say it's available and it's put out there for free for a reason, namely that it was intended to provoke discussion. So it's great to have this session. And thank you, Marc-Andre, to you and the Centre for rescuing this little essay from potential obscurity and shining a light on. So as I kind of look back on it 8 years later, certainly I had some thoughts rereading it, and I never feel wedded to things I've written in the past. I think academics, like everyone else, should be entitled to change our minds. But as I reread it, there were a number of thoughts that I had. One was that it's possible it was too intricate, and I could have found simpler things to say. And I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what that might be about. It occurred to me when I was reading it that although it sets up parallelism and arguments for why universities and academics should be interested in co-ops and vice versa, that in fact it appeared to me when I was rereading it that it's harder to explain universities than it is to explain cooperatives. And that was something that I thought came through and conditioned the nature of the essay. And that's something that we might want to go into in discussion. But although it's structured sort of to view from this side, view from that side, What's it look like for co-ops? What's it look like for universities to partner? In many ways, I think the piece that was more predominant was to think of the cooperatives as being the principals, and in what ways they could engage with a university or parts of a university as agents for things that they are interested in. So that sort of principal agent view. How can co-ops engage universities? How can they get what they want out of universities? I think was maybe a little bit more predominant than the other side. And as part of that, and maybe this is also the universities are hard to explain piece, a great deal of it was actually about not how to engage with universities, but how to engage with faculty members in universities. And that interesting reasons for that might be fun to talk about. But you know, it's not hard if you're a significant organization in society to sign an agreement of some kind with the university. But to actually get interesting work done, and the work of universities is teaching and research, you need to get faculty members involved. And that part is a whole lot trickier than actually signing an agreement. So I think that in many ways is the predominant concern in the piece. And it's possible as a result that you could read it as putting more onus on the co-ops to adapt to the reality of universities than vice versa. So the question of how should academia change to engage with co-ops is not really addressed in the essay as it is. That's an interesting topic as well. I think probably in what I was writing back then, I would say that materialist and structuralist assumptions predominated. And that's not to the exclusion of values. Certainly one of the recommendations at the end urges cooperatives and academics in universities to identify common values and engage on the basis of values as a way of developing a rapport in a relationship. I think if I was doing the sequel, I might maybe start with that piece and foreground it. But the reason why it focused on what it did, I think, has to do with another aspect. I would say any good piece of research or scholarship comes from some empirical question or observation and is intended to contribute to some empirical application. And that's true with this particular essay 8 years ago as well. And as noted in the piece, part of the background, really maybe one of the bigger empirical elements I had in mind, was the history of this center here at this university. So this is apropos of the 40th anniversary. 1984 was when this center became active. 1982 was when the founding documents were signed. And as I went through the papers some years ago, it must have been sometime in about 1980 that a number of key leaders in the co-op and university sector came together and had the discussions that led to all that. And that moment in about 1980 is one that I've always found fascinating to think about as to what the parties were looking for, why they developed the agreement they did, and how it lasted and evolved after that time. And worth remembering that way back then, the government of Saskatchewan was one of the founding partners and actually the largest single funder of the centre in its first contract. And in addition, the bigger cooperatives whose headquarters were in Saskatchewan were very significant leaders in that process. What those cooperatives specified in the centre's contract was that they wanted things like curricula and textbooks, university courses to be taught, speakers to be available for conferences. And I guess one aspect of that I've always found interesting is they weren't asking for things that would directly benefit their own organizations. This was Credit Union Central, Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, Federated Cooperatives, Cooperative College of Canada, really funding this center in order to create things that would be for the good of the whole cooperative sector or cooperative movement, not specifically for the founding organizations themselves and their own needs. That's really interesting to think about. So that's an alignment on the basis of values. I think a lot of it, I would speculate, in the minds of those co-op leaders probably had to do with the fifth cooperative principle and how cooperative education is interpreted. And certainly launched the center as a particular kind of collaboration. All of us who worked at the center in the 4 decades since it started, I think also experienced that there were some structural tensions that arose that had to do with the nature of the contracts, the funding and the renewals, the practical engagement with the university, obtaining faculty appointments and teaching, and maybe those things in particular are the ones I had in mind in writing this essay. So I guess if I were redoing it, I might emphasize the initial alignment on the basis of values, but the structural things is things that you need also to take care of if it's going to really be something that survives and thrives over time. Now, not mentioned in the piece, but also on my mind at the time, and I think interesting to think about, is that this isn't and wasn't the only center or chair for cooperative studies in Western Canada or in the world. So we've also seen that there was a center at the University of Victoria in British Columbia that did not survive. It was dependent on a single individual, and the great Ian McPherson, world famous cooperator, that a center that was tied to a single individual did not ultimately survive Ian's retirement and his passing. And we have chairs that the co-op sector has sponsored and created in Alberta and Manitoba. It'd be interesting to consider the purpose of those and how successfully, from the co-op sector's point of view, those purposes have been fulfilled. And further afield, I think we've all talked to our colleagues in other countries. I think of conversations with co-op study centers in the United States. And often the issue of how do you attract faculty, how do you engage, how do you retain faculty, how do you find people to lead these centers, is something that has come up over and over. And I don't know so much about in other countries, but I guess what I'm suggesting is there might be an interesting comparative project here for a grad student, if they were so inclined, is to think about the comparative evolution of cooperative studies, cooperative research centers in different places, in different countries. So I think there are perhaps some opportunities, tensions, creative and otherwise, that are inherent in the partnership model, and are not just part of this center's history, but are maybe more widespread and more universal. And that is, again, the reason for writing a piece and distributing it, is because it might find that resonance elsewhere. So those were some of the thoughts I had, Marc-Andre, looking back, and everyone can read the piece and they can see what it was. But those are some of the thoughts I had on rereading it, which I thought might also open up some nice conversation.
Fantastic.
I think it's the feedback from the 2 microphones.
Sure. Well, I'll say thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
This will be a fun this will be a fun chance.
Apologies, folks. Maybe Brett will have to hand his microphone to Stan.
Yeah, that might be
That might be the only
interesting forward.
Sure.
Sorry about that, folks.
Very well. So thank you, Brett. We knew there'd be some hiccups in this process. We're working through it. So I do want to open it up to questions. Before I do, I have a couple just to see the conversation a little bit. I want to pick up on that last comment about kind of broadening the lens beyond the center, right? In some of these chair positions, because I've heard through the grapevine, some of these chair positions have been endowed, and they get renewed based on the endowment funding. But the sector feels like they have lost much or any influence over what gets done. And I know this is a tension point you talked about in your paper, but in their minds, it's not even so much that they want research on a specific topic, but that they want some actual co-op output, right? And sometimes they feel the scholars drift quite a ways away. How do you think about that? So it's not so much directing the research, as just at least talk about the stuff that you're nominally been assigned to. Right? So what do you think of that?
Well, thanks, Mark Andre, and that thought and question kind of goes to the heart of the topic. And I would say universities are tricky partners because of collegial self-governance and academic freedom, all of that. It is the case that other kinds of centers are endowed or are funded, whether it's in business or science or social science or health science, and do manage to maintain that partnership over time. So what is it that causes there to be enough alignment or not? And in all of those cases, it can't be that the outside partners expect specific topics to be researched or specific kinds of results to be produced, because that just doesn't work. And I mentioned in the piece that if that's what co-ops are looking for, they should just hire researchers themselves and ask them to do that work. When you engage a university, you're looking for something different. But there should be an understanding of the field in which people work. And I would say maybe one thing, several things to look for, but I'd go back to that values alignment. There's, and some of the people here will have heard me talk about this, but I think the ICA statement on the cooperative identity is a very significant document and a really important touchstone that captures a whole lot and a whole lot more than a single sheet of paper may appear to represent. But in discussion of the statement on the cooperative identity, one point of view which the ICA, the International Cooperative Alliance itself, promotes is that the most important part of that statement is the values. So looking for connection and alignment around the values, I think, is an important starting point for keeping things on track. Then beyond that, I think it's a question of the structure of the center and the relationships that are developed, and in particular whether academics perceive it as an opportunity or an obligation to meet the requirements of a chair position or of a position in the center. So lots to talk about there. Those are a couple of initial thoughts.
Right, just before I open it up, I realize that we now have a logistical challenge for people who want to ask questions in the room. So what I'm going to do in just a minute is, if you have a question, you can ask it and I'll repeat it and we'll get it that way. That seems like the only path forward here. So one more question, Brett, because if anyone read the kind of announcement about your talk or your invitation here, we mentioned BC tree fruits, and this has been nagging at me since we had the idea of inviting you, because it seems to me there are. I'm interested in your thoughts on some parallels that we might draw, because it seems like what happened with BC tree fruits is a governance problem. There surely were external challenges of competition and high land prices, but there were a lot of governance issues with an organization that couldn't manage or navigate the membership divisions, culturally or otherwise. The board that seemed very operational, with a lot of turnover in their CEOs, 5 CEOs in 7 years, a lot of focus on operations, on strategy, and an unwillingness to pursue director training and things like that. These are what we understand from publicly available information that's out there. And it occurs to me that there's some kind of, it speaks to a larger tension that I think is embodied in co-ops, but universities and society at large, which is this democratic impulse that feeds up people onto these positions of decision making. And an organization has to take a long view and has to kind of account for all these structural and other changes that may not be visible for democratic kind of decision making. And I think that it seems to me that universities also face that challenge. They're often increasingly under scrutiny from political space. So is there something that each can learn from each other, that they're both experiencing kind of these similar tensions of democratic impulses here, and at the same time these kind of challenges of managing big complex organizations with long-lived assets, long-lived needs to invest in things. What do you think of that? This kind of been nagging at me, this societal challenge in a sense.
There's one or two people in the room who've actually worked with the board and management of BC Tree Fruits, and I'm not one of them. So I think some of the answers are embedded in your question and your comments, Marc-Andre. I guess I would single out one thing in particular that bears thinking about, and that is that members of BC Tree Fruits, when faced with the decision of delivering product to their cooperative or a competitor, chose to deliver the higher value product to competitors in large numbers, and to deal with their cooperative as the last resort for the product that others were less excited to take. So members were price seeking, I guess, and not being loyal to their cooperative. So in that, there are a variety of, it's a collective action failure. There's a variety of, I think, governance failures that we can surmise that go into that behavior, including a lack of trust in other members as well as in the board. So it's that basic governance in a cooperative of choosing your own course of action as a member of the co-op in light of your mental model of what the other members are going to do. And at a certain point, if you think other members are going to be opportunistic, then the wheels start to come off the whole enterprise. So there is a similarity there, I think, to some other cooperative failures that we've looked at over the years. And I guess the question that came to my mind is, again, relating it to the history of the centre. We had the Saskatchewan wheat pool that certainly affected everyone in this province and directly affected our centre. We had Co-op Atlantic, we had Mountain Equipment Co-op, we had BC Tree Fruits. And I know we have Marie Fulton in the room, who's a co-author of a paper on when big co-ops fail, which is a starting point, I think, for some of the centre's ongoing analysis of these cases. But that's an interesting topic. But I guess the thing that came to my mind is I can point to the co-op failures in other countries. I found it interesting a number of years ago to look at the collapse of farmland enterprises in the United States, which really looked to me like mission drift as a key part of the failure. I've written about the collapse of the co-op group in Germany. I'm not sure I can think of another country that has had the series of large co-op failures that Canada has had in the last 20 years. So apart from understanding each individual one of them, I think a really interesting topic for discussion and for some enterprising graduate student or faculty member out there would be, why have we seen all of these in Canada? Is there any connection among them? Maybe it's just that one set an example, it's like dominoes, or maybe there's something cultural or something legal or whatever it may be behind it. But that's getting off the topic of your original question. But I think it is it's one of the reasons why co-op centers ought to exist, is to think about things like that, which is not a question that co-ops may have foreseen when they created the whole thing.
All right, so now we're going to turn it to the audience. Folks, if you have a question in person, put your hand up, I'll come to you. In the meantime, I have a couple questions online. And I also want to note that somebody made a comment, there's of course St. Mary's University.
Yes.
And their school of management.
I also mentioned that. I think
Quebec
stops my series in Ontario.
Fair enough. Okay, so this question's from Mitch, another one of our fellows. He says, hi Brett, can you speak to navigating the structural tension between established co-op sectors that have the resources and the emerging co-op sectors which meet new community needs that are typically under-resourced?
Mm-hmm. I can say something about that. It's a bigger topic than I can speak to, but I guess relating it to the topic of the paper and the history of the co-op center here, I certainly positioned this center as being a project of the large co-ops that have the financial resources and the management and leadership capacity to get it going, but for the benefit of the entire sector. So if you think about it from that point of view, our origins as a center here are really in the realm of mutualism. It's one group of leaders in the co-op sector getting something started for the benefit of all. So that is a way in which large established co-ops with more resources can cause things to happen, can give back, so to speak, can support the development of new sectors. And there's other examples that a person could point to. So I guess in maybe connecting on to my previous topic, I think Canada has lost something by the fact that we no longer have some of those large cooperatives that have the resources to undertake these kinds of projects. And that's worth thinking about. But fortunately, we haven't lost all of them. That's significant. But I'd kind of put it in those terms that there are projects that big cooperatives can undertake, support the sector, support the education of the public and of prospective members of cooperatives, directly support the development of other cooperatives, which we've seen. And all of that is something that when it happens, those cooperatives do out of a commitment to the sector and not specifically to their short-term material self-interest.
Yes. So folks in the room, any hands up? Anyone want to ask a question for online? Yes.
I'd just like to hear Brett talk a bit more about the spirit of treaties that you mentioned in your early remarks and what that would mean for universities and the sector.
Okay, so just to repeat that, Isabel would like to hear more about the spirit of the treaties, what that means for the relationship between the co-ops and universities.
I sort of feel that putting this in the format of questions and answers is doesn't do it justice. This would be a great topic for a really lively and fulsome conversation. So I started off referencing the spirit of treaties as peoples working in parallel for the advancement of all, and using that imagery specifically to reference the two-row wampum and other symbols of the meaning of treaty. So I think that is a good framework to think of as a backdrop for collaboration and for partnership. But of course, with a sense of obligation that goes with it. In this room where we are, there are the pictures here of the red dresses, which is referencing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, an important topic also in BC, where I'm currently located, the Highway of Tears. Kamloops, of course, specifically in 2021, was the site where the realization came of the extent of the Sweetway, the missing children from the residential schools. So these are heavy topics that are very difficult for Indigenous communities to grapple with. So lots of obligations that come from being located in these places. And I'm also intrigued by the differences between Treaty 6 territory and Secwepemc, where I am now. So here we can reference spirit of the treaties and think about it within that framework and think about the peoples who are signatories to those treaties. In Kamloops, like in the majority of the land in British Columbia, there are no modern treaties. So there are ancient historical treaties that have some application, but located on unceded land, I think the implications are quite different. So in terms of research at TRU and how we engage with that, it really means that the axis of connection with Indigenous people has to be the connection with our specific host people. So with Tecumseh, Secwepemc for our Kamloops campus, with Elk for our Williams Lake campus. And so we have developed partnership agreements with them that govern the relationship. And I would say when it comes to scholarship, very interestingly, our host people in Secwepemc have developed their own set of research ethics guidelines, which is a really interesting opportunity for universities to collaborate. But to locate that discussion not at SHRC or the tri-agencies, not in the university, but for the academically trained members of the wider First Nation to actually say these are the principles to follow. And they produced a marvelous document. It's I think about 32 pages. It lays out principles for research in Secwepemc communities, and it then interprets and applies those. This is what it means if you're a faculty member. This is what it means if you're a PhD student, and so on. These are the are obligations based on the land that we're on. And where I am right now, that's a really specific obligation to a specific host community, and through that to Indigenous people generally. And I think in a numbered treaty country, it's a little bit different. And that's less immediately on my mind right now, I would say. But I have always been taken by the idea that the spirit of the treaties, where we have treaties, is something that people can attach to develop those relationships. And being in a place that does not have treaties, it's actually much more directly and immediately about the partnership relationship with the First Nation.
Okay, so we'll to a question online here from Aaron. So, Brett, in thinking about the relationship between universities and co-ops, we're in part talking about the relationship between researchers and practitioners. So, how does or should the process of knowledge translation happen in this relationship? Does that look?
It's a great question, and I know I always try to translate things into simple terms to think through my answers. So researcher and practitioner are categories, knowledge translation is the process. So first of all, I guess I'd say the categories of researcher and practitioner are not as separate from each other as it might sound. There's a lot of what practitioners do that may be the same activities as what some researchers are doing, and vice versa. But in that connection, I go back to one of my opening comments that I think any good research in a university is usually, probably, maybe always inspired by some empirical insight or concern, and is usually carried out with some potential application in mind. So in that sense, it's possible for every academic researcher to think of themselves as a practitioner, but with the difference, to be sure, in accountabilities and time frames. I think in knowledge translation is language universities use. I'm not sure. I'd be curious whether people in co-ops use that language or think about it that way. That might be an interesting concept to deconstruct. It sort of implies that the knowledge is in one place and needs to be put into other words for someone else to understand it. I guess I would think for things co-op, it's probably more helpful to think about co-creation and about engagement in that mode.
I almost want to just leave the mic here because I have a quick thought pursuit. I mean, it seems like you could draw a link to what you just said and Isabel's questions about relationship with Indigenous people. Maybe you could elaborate on that before we look at that.
I mean, there's a lot there to talk about. I don't that I have a special insight to go there, but I would say, yeah. So if we think about the principles for ethical research in partnership with Indigenous communities, so research by, for, and with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, it's interesting to think about those as not just being necessary, very important principles for Indigenous research, but it's actually just good research principles, period. So the opportunity to learn from that and practice some of the same things, I think the opportunity is there to think about it that way. So to think about if you want to study a cooperative, a sector of cooperatives, a group of cooperatives, whose permission should you have to do that? That's a really interesting question. Do you get to cherry pick your participants from the ones that you would pick, or should there be a relationship with the organization, an opportunity for them to identify what the research questions are and who the participants are? And I think that gets into the territory of how academics at the center have developed a pattern of working with cooperatives over the years, which is really not just studying them from outside, but really having that partnership and engagement model.
I do have another question online, but before we do, I have to ask one more. Building on that, you pointed out in your paper one of the potential tension points is scholars have to publish and they get rewarded for publications, and maybe not so much rewarded for all the work that goes into building those relationships. And over time, you talk about the importance of relationships over time. Have you seen any change in the university's attitudes towards that kind of work, that engagement work, and valuing it formally, instead of just kind of a good job. Has that changed at all since you wrote this paper and from your perch where you are now?
Yes, absolutely. There is change. It's change in various directions. So there are certain parts of universities that have become more oriented towards counting conventional publications in conventional places. And I'll try not to mention business schools when I say that. But there are other places where there's been a lively discussion about considering things that are equivalent to that kind of body of work or that kind of publication. Again, the parallels with a First Nations Métis Inuit scholarship kind of come to mind, of valuing the partnership building work and preserving the principle that academics should have outputs, must have outputs, must have outcomes, must have impacts, but be willing to think about different ways in which those things can occur. So I think there is movement, and that's a very good thing. Yes.
Any questions from the audience here before I turn to another question online? I see Dion. Go ahead, Dion.
I'm not going to ask this, but I think it's a question about, we talk about relationships, and my experience in working with co-ops has been relationships between individuals that form. And in some ways, co-ops form, and also why we fall apart is because those relationships, those thick ties between people within the sector, even between Indigenous communities and the university or university and the co-op sector, they kind of break apart. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about that. It's not about university and co-op sector or co-ops and co-ops or Indigenous communities and universities. It's about relationships between people or groups of people that know each other by name, that connect, that I don't know how to ask this question, but.
So Dion doesn't know how to ask her question, but her question relates to how we think about these relationships, not necessarily the organization relationship between co-op and university, but the researcher and practitioner, for want of a better word, relationships, and how we work with those, sustain them so they don't fall apart, something like that, right? Yeah. Between
Sure. So I mean, all relationships between organizations involve relationships between individual people, and those are really significant to animating the work, to providing guidance. To someone has to articulate the goals and interests of different parties. I guess and maybe where I go at it slightly differently is to say, you could work very hard to have the perfect relationship with among a group of individuals, and then there's an election, and those directors are out of office, or something goes on in management, and the manager is gone. So on the academic side, it's true that most academics in Canada stay in their roles for many years. So maybe there's less turnover there if you're dealing with tenured academics. But I guess it leads me to think about what are the relationships that provide a framework to deal with changes in the individuals. And so that's where I fall back on values and spending time with each other. So new people can be brought along, different people can step into different roles. Certainly some of the discontinuities in our center's history, some of the stress points happened because individual people changed. And yeah, so it's not, it's always an opportunity when you have new people coming in, but you really want to have that happen within some framework. And I guess in my thinking on the subject, I've been thinking more about what provides the context for the individual relationships to develop and be reproduced over time.
Okay, so a slightly different question here from Colin. Colin asks or says, many universities have entrepreneurship contests with capital prizes and technical assistance to bring top proposals from students to fruition in their community. Can and should the development of partnerships with universities and cooperatives presumably include fostering such possibilities for co-ops?
I'll fall back on some of the research the center has done, which isn't particularly my research. But I know one of the observations that people at this center have made over the years is that co-op development as a process has some differences from the development of for-profit enterprises. And I think one of the ways that I recall people putting it in our context is that to develop a co-op, you first need to develop a group. So you need to build the cohesion among a group of people for them to coalesce around an idea. And the idea of entrepreneurship, and certainly in a business context, usually assumes, in my experience, that entrepreneurship is an idea in the mind of an individual. So that group development, group building process isn't there. So you can imagine what would it look like to have a co-op building process, a co-op building competition. And I guess one short observation would be that we'd have to have a longer time frame.
Well, if there's a question here, I want to build on that a little bit because I think that's a really important and interesting point because it's a struggle. Like Dion was saying the other day in the business school, they have competitions and entrepreneur competitions, and there's no discussion co-ops. Where there does seem to be a little bit of purchase is social enterprise. This notion of social enterprise, impact investing, these kinds of ways in. How do you see any opportunity for the co-op sector to kind of ride that or use that? Or, I'm seeing more, like I believe the University of Victoria has done some work for us to set aside some portion of their investment endowment to invest in impact investing, community type investing. Do you see any way to that kind of bringing the co-ops more front and center and maybe giving this the time needed to do that development work?
A short digression into theory, I suppose, because it's what it provokes for me. So I think co-ops, social movements, alternative organizations arise and legitimate themselves by using existing institutions and models. So a term like social enterprise that can be a way in for co-ops, but it requires actually doing the work to make the co-op content real and to work with the opportunities that are there and to bring them to bear, to bring them in to creating and sustaining a cooperative. And that's not easy, but I would say it takes a committed group of people who know what they're doing, and it's a conscious activity. And I say for me, it makes me think of theory because I think that this is actually where cooperatives came from. People had ways of working together before there were things that we now see as being officially cooperatives. And what people discovered, and this is Isabel's time period, you did your doctoral research on, what people discovered is that you could take the idea of a corporation, the idea of a friendly society, of a democratic organization, you can take existing terms, legislation, institutions, and mix them together differently to make a co-op. So I think that actually is what the project is, but it's not as simple as just saying, social enterprise so we can do co-ops. I think it takes a network and a group of people to make it mean something.
I do want to make sure folks feel free to ask your questions online and monitoring those questions. There is a comment here from Kathy who says there will be a co-op-a-thon at the ICA Global Conference in Delhi this November. That sounds fun. So Brett, maybe just building on your last comments, I noticed one province in particular, Quebec, has a vigorous cooperative sector and often comes in under the social economy kind of umbrella. In fact, that province just awarded $4 million to a group of researchers to study how they can deepen the influence of the social economy in the province. Most of them are co-op researchers. Have you seen any? And of course, the history of the center is with the province seeding a lot of centers early funding. Do you see any political appetite outside of Quebec for thinking this way, and how do you, and engaging with the university environment in the cooperative sector? So that's like a third party to this conversation.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I hadn't referred to Quebec in my comments, and it's sort of the obvious example to look at inside the boundaries of Canada, for where there are strong cooperative centers, strong partnerships with co-ops, and with the state, which isn't incidental. I think there are two things in particular that stand out for me in Quebec. So one is the whole process of securing the support of government for cooperative development. And there's a lot of conflict involved in that story that referring back to what we just alluded to, social economy sociale was a way in for co-ops, but it wasn't an unproblematic way in. There were some tensions that had to be resolved for co-ops to be recognized as legitimately part of the economy sociale and part of what the government is trying to develop there. So there's some contests that go on behind the scenes and some coalition building that was done. The other thing that occurs to me, though, is it's not just state power, it's also the idea of a collective sectoral enterprise in Quebec has a nationalistic grounding to it that makes sense to people there. And we don't so much have an equivalent of that in many other parts of Canada. So there are some things to point to, and those may create suggestions, I guess, for people about how we could cause more to happen. I think linking back to a topic that came up early in today's conversation, I think established cooperatives that have resources, and I'm not necessarily thinking of money, but have people with time and opportunities to connect with government can certainly make a difference, and that's part of what the Quebec example shows. I would also say that it's connections beyond the existing cooperative sector. It has been really clear to me that housing is considered a crisis right now all across Canada. It's hard not to think back to when housing was considered a crisis almost 50 years ago, and a federally supported cooperative housing program was part of the answer. So really interesting to look at how that came about. And in that case, it was the then Cooperative Union of Canada, it was the Canadian Labour Congress, it was the Canadian Union of Students. It was a group of organizations that decided to launch a housing program that co-ops would be a main vehicle. So there are maybe some old ideas that could be current again, and maybe a similar coalition could be built around.
Great, thanks, Brian. I just got a text here that we're having some audio challenges, so we'll just hold the microphone a little closer. Is that helping? Understand? Do you know? Can you check the post? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions here from the floor or online? Otherwise, I'll have to ask them. Oh, here we go.
Sorry, I heard a piece, one of the theory appreciates the not wrong, but not the most important unit of analysis. Like the unit is the faculty, I think, right? Or the research unit. Usually schools of business, and I say that as somebody who doesn't know much about co-ops, instead of places like JSGS. But it seems like to fix the longevity issue and sort of some funding issues even, the approach would be to essentially capture in a regulatory sense a faculty or faculties of business, I think, and I'm sort of thinking out loud. But I'm still stuck on sort of your point from earlier as to why do that instead of taking that energy and those resources and instead establishing well built out research units within a cooperative organization itself, like FCM.
Okay, so I think the question is posing this kind of choice between capturing, if I can use that term, business profs, business schools versus going out and building the resources themselves outside the university context. Do you have a thought on that, Brett?
Again, an enterprising grad student or researcher might do a certain of models. I'm not sure whether business schools are the most common home for things like this. So faculties of ag economics, faculties of development economics, sometimes sociology, sometimes adult education, and sometimes thoroughly interdisciplinary, which is really more the route that Saskatchewan went. So I wouldn't say the connection with business schools is automatic. And, we have people participating in the session today who can speak about the realities of business schools from inside, and I think could maybe shine further light on that. So I wouldn't assume that that's the case. But on the other point, I'd actually encourage co-ops to think about that. Why engage a university or a university academic instead of just hiring a salaried researcher and getting them to work on what you want them to work on? And I think that kind of goes to the heart of the matter, is what do co-ops get by choosing to work with the university instead of doing that? And both are realistic choices. You can think about if you get your sheet of paper with advantages and disadvantages of both models. But I'd say if everything works, the advantage of engaging a university, the advantages include a kind of legitimacy that you don't get with a staff person of your own organization doing research. They include access to students in degree credit programs who may go on to become government officials or other people that you may deal with from your co-op. So I guess and maybe the key point I'd simply make is that the co-op should be clear on which of those things they're looking for. And if it is something that goes beyond what their own research department can do, then to look at how to engage a university or engage faculty members to obtain that. And I would add, just as a historical footnote, when this center was created, co-ops also have their own researchers and also have the Cooperative College of Canada, which was a training institute for directors and managers. So they had all of that stuff and decided they also wanted or needed a foothold in universities. And that's a really interesting moment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brett. So I think we're going to wrap up here. It's just about 1 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for attending, and well, Brett especially for being part of this, leading the conversation. It was a wonderful discussion. I love where you took things with these awkward questions, especially mine. And thank you all for participating today. We're going to be sending out a recording of the session. Hopefully quality is okay the next day or so. I know we had our challenges today. But our next co-op conversation, I just want to flag that, is going to be on Wednesday, October 2nd, and it's going to feature another one of our fellows. We're profiling our fellows this year. That's our strategy. Dr. Mitch Diamantopoulos. I apologize, Mitch. It's much easier to say your first name. Mitch's talk is entitled Building Journalism Back Better. Can News Cooperatives Solve Journalism and Democracy's Deep in Crisis? And Mitch has done some really interesting work about something that's absolutely essential to our modern day society. So I urge people to join in. For those who are in Saskatoon, we also have an upcoming event under the auspices of the University of Saskatchewan's Communities and Sustainability Signature, which we played a key role in catalyzing. And that's on October 1st, and it's with the renowned historian, journalist, and author Wayne Dyer. Will be visiting our university and giving a talk about his new book, Intervention Earth, Life-Saving Ideas from the World's Climate Engineers. And he'll be giving that talk at 3 p.m., followed by a book signing, and we're going to be launching news about that event in the coming days. Thank you all again for taking time to attend today's co-op conversation. Thank you, Brett, for making your way to Saskatoon and helping us pilot this hybrid event. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Talk to you soon.